The world's largest ethnic group has one name, one flag, one origin story. There's just one problem. The DNA says that story never happened. Look around you. Right now in Tokyo, 12 million people are getting on trains, drinking coffee, heading to work. They look like one people. They act like one people. They call themselves one people. But inside every single cell of their bodies, something extraordinary is hiding. A genetic code so old, so strange, so unlike anything else on Earth that scientists spent decades trying to explain it. And even now, they can't fully agree on what it means. Here is the thing that your history teacher never told you. Japan is not what it looks like from the outside. Most of us were taught that civilization spread from the Middle East. Agriculture, writing, pottery, it all started there, right? And then slowly spread to the rest of the world. But Japan's DNA tells a completely different story. Researchers found pottery in a site called Oda Yamamoto in northern Japan. When they tested it, they were shocked. Those clay pieces were made around 14,500 BCE. That is 16,000 years ago. That makes them among the oldest pottery ever found on Earth, made by people living in Japan thousands of years before the rest of the world had even thought of making pots. And that is just the beginning, because modern Japanese people are not one single group. Geneticists confirmed through ancient DNA analysis that every person living in Japan today carries 3 completely different ancestral bloodlines, from 3 different peoples, 3 different time periods, and 3 completely different parts of the world. Think about that. So one person, 3 ancient worlds living inside them. What does it mean to carry the blood of a people whose name has been forgotten, whose language is gone, whose face you will never see? If you're fascinated by lost histories and ancient DNA mysteries, hit subscribe right now. Because what we're about to uncover took scientists decades to piece together, and it will change how you see the entire human story. But before we go any further, I need to ask you something. Drop it in the comments right now. Where in the world are you watching this from? And have you ever done a DNA ancestry test? What did it show? Because by the end of this video, you might seriously want to order one. Now, let's go back. Way back. Before Japan had a name, before it had a government, before it had a language, there was a people. Or a people who lived on these islands for over 30,000 years, almost completely alone. Scientists call their DNA a ghost lineage, and that ghost is still alive inside millions of people today. That ghost lineage has a name, the Jomon. And their story begins around 38,000 BCE, during the last ice age, when massive sheets of ice covered most of the northern world. Sea levels were much lower. Land bridges existed where oceans are today, and a group of humans, following animals, following coastlines, following survival, crossed into what would become the Japanese archipelago. They didn't know they were doing something historic. They were just trying to stay alive. But they stayed, and they stayed, and they stayed, for thousands and thousands of years. Well, these people lived on these islands almost completely cut off from the rest of the world. No contact, no outsiders. Just them, the sea, the mountains, and time. And something very unusual happened because of that isolation. Their DNA drifted. It mutated. It developed into something completely unique. Scientists found a genetic marker in these people called Haplogroup D. It's a marker carried in the Y chromosome, passed from father to son. And here is where things get strange. This exact marker, Haplogroup D, appears at high levels in only 3 places on Earth: Japan, the Tibetan Mountains, and the Andaman Islands, a tiny chain of islands sitting in the middle of the Indian Ocean, thousands of miles from Japan, with no recorded contact with the Japanese people. 3 groups, 3 isolated corners of the world, on one ancient genetic thread. Scientists estimate that the Japanese version and the Andaman Islands version split from each other around 53,000 years ago, which means both groups came from the same ancient wave of humans who walked out of Africa. They split, they separated, they never spoke again. But the DNA never forgot, and here is the number that should stop you cold. Approximately 40% of Japanese men today carry this ancient Haplogroup D marker. That means nearly half of all Japanese men are, genetically, closer to a fisherman on a remote Indian Ocean island than they are to a Chinese man living just 500 miles away. The Jomon were not primitive people wandering in caves. They built complex spiritual rituals. They traded along coastlines. And they created pottery with beautiful rope cord patterns, which is actually what the word Jomon means, rope pattern. They built communities. They buried their dead with care. They had a life. And for roughly 15,000 years, this entire archipelago was theirs. No competitors, no outsiders, just the Jomon and the islands. But around 900 BCE, everything changed. Boats appeared on the horizon, and the people on those boats carried DNA that the Jomon had never once encountered in 15,000 years. The collision that followed would change the blood of an entire nation, forever. Imagine you have lived in your home your whole life. Your parents lived there. Their parents lived there. Every single person you have ever known lived in that same valley, on that same land, under that same sky. And then one day, strangers arrive. They have different tools, different food, different faces, and they are not leaving. That is what happened to the Jomon. Starting around 900 BCE, a new group began arriving on the Japanese islands. Researchers call them the Yayoi. They came from the Korean peninsula and the coastal regions of what is now China. They were farmers. They brought rice. They brought iron tools. They brought a completely different way of living, and they brought a completely different genome. The Yayoi carried genetic markers called Haplogroup O and C, the dominant markers of Han Chinese and Korean populations. A 2021 study published in the journal Science Advances, led by researchers at Trinity College Dublin and Kanazawa University, sequenced 12 ancient Japanese genomes and confirmed exactly this. Two very different peoples. So two very different DNA profiles, and they were now living on the same islands. For centuries, the archaeological record shows Jomon and Yayoi settlements existing side by side, not in peace, in tension, conflict, slowly, cautiously, intermarriage, children born who carried both worlds inside them. Here is what the science shows, and this is important. The Yayoi did not replace the Jomon. They did not wipe them out. The Jomon were absorbed. Their DNA was diluted, passed down through generations of mixed children until the original Jomon signal became a minority inside a growing Yayoi-dominant population. But it never disappeared completely. And here is the cultural contradiction that sits at the heart of modern Japanese identity. Japan's national soul, the warrior spirit, the reverence for nature, the animist beliefs, one of the deep connection to the land, all of that traces back to Jomon roots. It lives in Shinto. It lives in the mountains and forests that Japanese culture treats as sacred. It lives in the spiritual relationship with the natural world that has defined Japanese life for thousands of years. But genetically, the majority of a modern Japanese person's DNA is Yayoi, meaning continental East Asian, meaning Korean and Chinese in origin. Japan built an identity around being uniquely, purely Japanese. But the DNA quietly says, more than half of that identity has its closest relatives across the sea. That is not an insult. That is the honest story of how peoples and cultures are actually born. But here is the thing. The Yayoi wave was only the second layer. Centuries later, a third migration arrived. So one that was so genetically powerful and so politically explosive that when the Japanese emperor finally admitted it publicly in the year 2001, most Japanese media refused to cover the story. December 2001. Emperor Akihito of Japan stands before a room of people and says something that no Japanese emperor had ever said before. He says, the mother of Emperor Kanmu, one of the most powerful emperors in Japanese history, the man who moved the capital to Kyoto, was a direct descendant of the royal line of Baekje, a Korean kingdom. In South Korea, it was front-page news. In Japan, most major media outlets stayed quiet, because this statement did something very uncomfortable. It cracked the foundation of a myth that had held Japanese national identity together for over 1,000 years. The idea of a divine, unbroken, a purely Japanese imperial bloodline stretching back to the gods. But here is the thing. Emperor Akihito was not sharing gossip. He was reading from the official imperial historical records. It was documented, it was real, and the DNA agrees. The period between roughly 250 and 710 CE is called the Kofun period in Japan. And this era saw a massive third wave of migration, Not farmers this time, but skilled artisans, Buddhist monks, scholars, scribes, and members of the Korean aristocracy arriving from the kingdoms of Baekje and Goguryeo. The same 2021 Science Advances study confirmed something remarkable. This Kofun wave was not just another trickle of migrants. It was enormous. It was genetically distinct from the Yayoi who came before, and it hit the Japanese gene pool like a wave. The study found that Jomon ancestry was diluted by approximately a factor of 4 between the Yayoi and Kofun periods. That means the Kofun migration was bigger and more genetically impactful than the Yayoi migration that everyone talks about. Think about the giant Kofun burial mounds, the ones you can see on satellite images across Japan. Some of them are larger at the base than the Egyptian pyramids. The bronze mirrors inside them, the silk burial robes, the Buddhist iconography, all of it traces back aesthetically and culturally to the Korean peninsula and the Chinese mainland. Japan's most ancient-looking imperial traditions are, in large part, imported. And here is the modern reality that this creates. A person living in Tokyo today carries, on average, somewhere between 13 and 20% Jomon ancestry. The rest, Yayoi, Kofun, Korean, Northeast Asian, continental. The most Japanese genetic component inside a Japanese person is actually the minority. 3 waves, 3 peoples, 3 genetic worlds fused into one national identity. But the story is still not complete, because there is a community in Japan that none of these waves fully absorbed. A people who held on to the oldest blood through everything: colonization, erasure, forced assimilation. Japan's own government spent 150 years trying to make them disappear. But their DNA survived everything. In the northern island of Hokkaido, there is a people called the Ainu. They have lived here longer than the concept of Japan has existed, and today, scientists confirm that they carry the highest concentration of Jomon DNA of any living population on Earth. When you look at old photographs of Ainu people, something immediately stands out. They don't look like the East Asian features most people associate with Japan. They have deeper-set eyes, heavier body hair, facial features that look almost Siberian, or in some images, almost European. This confused and disturbed the Meiji government in the late 1800s. Officials called them a dying race. They passed laws banning the Ainu language. They forced Ainu children into assimilation schools. They took their land. They tried to turn them into Japanese people and erase everything that came before. Now here is the genetic reality. Research published in the journal Nature and confirmed in multiple subsequent studies found that the Ainu gene pool is a combination of ancient Jomon-type DNA, Daza Okhotsk culture ancestry from populations that came down through the northern Pacific, and a Siberian genetic component linked to populations around Lake Baikal in Russia. The Ainu are, genetically, a living archive of the entire northern Pacific migration corridor. Every wave that swept through the top of the world left a trace inside them. But perhaps the most haunting fact about the Ainu is not their DNA. It is their language. Ainu is a language isolate. It has no confirmed relatives anywhere on Earth. It is not related to Japanese, not to Korean, not to Chinese, not to any Siberian language, not to any language family that linguists have ever identified. It is a linguistic fossil, a language that evolved alone in isolation over thousands of years, and then was almost completely destroyed in the span of 1 century. Many of the elders who remembered the songs, the stories, the ceremonies, they are gone now. Japan officially recognized the Ainu as an indigenous people in 2019, 150 years after the Meiji government began erasing them. By the time that recognition came, most of what the Ainu knew was already lost. But here is what makes this story even more extraordinary. When scientists traced that Siberian genetic component inside Ainu DNA, when they followed it back along the migration route through Kamchatka, through the Amur River Basin, they found that same ancient signal somewhere else, not in Asia, in North America. What you're about to hear sounds impossible, but it is peer-reviewed science. On the ancient Siberian genetic component found inside Ainu and Jomon DNA, researchers call the source population Ancient Paleo-Siberian, and this ghost population, which no longer exists as a distinct group, left its mark in 2 places on Earth. 1. The early inhabitants of the Japanese archipelago. 2. The first peoples of the Americas, particularly the native populations of the Pacific Northwest coast of North America. A 2016 study from the David Reich Lab at Harvard University, published in the journal Nature, confirmed this. The same ancestral population contributed DNA to both the earliest Japanese islanders and the first settlers of the Americas. They shared a common ancestor somewhere in Siberia during the late Ice Age. One group pushed south and east into the Americas, whilst the other pushed south into the Japanese archipelago and became the Jomon. Same origin, different journeys, different histories, same genome. Picture this: a genetic family tree that stretches from Hokkaido, north to Kamchatka, across the Bering Land Bridge, down into Alaska, and along the coast to British Columbia. Not drawn in ink. Drawn in actual human DNA, preserved in bones and teeth for 15,000 years, read by machines that didn't exist 20 years ago. If a Jomon descendant in Hokkaido and a Haida elder on the coast of British Columbia share an ancestor from a Siberian population that no longer exists, are they, in some ancient and forgotten sense, family? Think about what this means for the larger story. Japan is not genetically isolated, it is genetically connected to the Pacific, to Siberia, down to the first Americans, through a migration corridor that predates all recorded history, all written language, all named civilizations. The story of Japanese DNA is also, in part, the story of how the Western Hemisphere was first populated. But the Siberian thread is only one of the surprises hidden inside Japan's genetic map. In the southern islands, in Okinawa, scientists found something entirely different. A genetic signal pointing not north toward Siberia, but south, toward the tropical seas of Southeast Asia. And the story attached to that signal involves a kingdom that most people have never heard of, a civilization that was conquered and then quietly erased from the map. Okinawa looks like a paradise: blue water, white sand, coral reefs. When nearly 2 million people living on a chain of subtropical islands at the southern tip of what we call Japan today. But genetically, Okinawa is a completely different story from the mainland. A study published in the Journal of Human Genetics in 2023 confirmed that Ryukyu people, the indigenous people of the Okinawa region, carry approximately 36% Jomon ancestry. Compare that to the average of around 13 to 17% for mainland Japanese. Okinawans carry more than double the Jomon DNA of their supposed countrymen on the mainland. On top of that, their genome contains a maritime genetic signal, components linked to ancient seafaring populations that once sailed through Taiwan, the Philippines, and deep into the Pacific Ocean. A prehistoric maritime network that connected islands across thousands of miles of open water. Okinawa was not always part of Japan. It was the Ryukyu Kingdom, a sovereign, independent nation with its own language, its own king, its own diplomacy, its own trade network connecting China, Korea, and Southeast Asia simultaneously. A kingdom that sat at the center of the Pacific trading world. Then, in 1879, Japan forcibly annexed it during the Meiji period. The king was taken to Tokyo, the language was suppressed, the history was rewritten. The Ryukyuan language, also a language with no confirmed relatives in the same family as Japanese, began to disappear. Today, most young people in Okinawa speak standard Japanese. The old language is fading. Here's the irony. Okinawans carry more Jomon DNA than almost anyone on mainland Japan. They are, in a genetic sense, closer to the original inhabitants of these islands than the people who annexed them. They are more ancient Japanese than Japan itself. And yet, for over a century, they were treated as peripheral, lesser, a region to be assimilated rather than respected. Their genetic story, their cultural story, their political story, all of it is written in DNA that mainland Japan would rather not examine too closely. But the questions that Okinawa raises, about who belongs, about what makes a people, those questions lead us somewhere even darker, to a group inside Japan that was never genetically different, never a different people, but was treated as if they were a separate race entirely, for centuries. Before we get to that darker story, stop for a moment. Picture a Japanese grandmother, early morning. She walks to a small Shinto shrine near her home. She washes her hands in a stone basin. She claps twice. She bows. She ties a small folded paper to the branch of a sacred tree. She has done this her whole life. Her mother did it. Her grandmother did it. But she almost certainly doesn't know this. That ritual, in its deepest form, is approximately 15,000 years old. Anthropologists and archaeologists have long argued that the spiritual architecture of Shinto, the animism, the reverence for forests and mountains and rivers, the belief that spirits live inside natural things, traces directly back to Jomon religion, practiced on these islands long before the Yayoi arrived with agriculture. And here is the genetic map that makes this even more remarkable. The populations in Japan that carry the highest levels of Jomon DNA, people in the Tohoku region of northern Honshu, people in Okinawa, people in Hokkaido, are also the populations that maintain the most ancient, nature-rooted forms of local spiritual practice, the most archaic shrine formats, the deepest connection to landscape as sacred space. DNA and ritual are sitting on the exact same geographic map. That grandmother tying her prayer to a tree is, without knowing it, channeling a spiritual tradition that is older than the Roman Empire, older than the construction of the pyramids, older than the wheel. She is channeling the Jomon. Then Buddhism arrived in the 6th century CE, brought by those Kofun period Korean migrants. It was state-sponsored, architecturally magnificent, philosophically complex. In most other civilizations, a powerful imported religion would have replaced what came before. Japan didn't let that happen. Japan did something no other culture had quite done in the same way. It kept both, simultaneously. Shinto and Buddhism fused into a spiritual life that still exists in Japan today, where people get Shinto wedding ceremonies and Buddhist funerals without seeing any contradiction. That flexibility, that capacity to absorb and hold two things at once, it is, perhaps, the most Japanese thing of all. But not everyone in Japan was included in that story, because Japan, a nation obsessed with the idea of ancestral purity, was hiding a secret about its own people. A secret that, when you look at the science, turns out to be one of the most brutal and absurd lies in history. There is a group of people in Japan called the Burakumin. Make estimates put their number somewhere between 1 and 3 million people. And for centuries, they were treated as outcasts, barred from certain neighborhoods, excluded from certain jobs, rejected for marriage. Socially, they existed at the very bottom. What was their crime? Their ancestors, generations and generations ago, worked in occupations that Buddhist and Shinto doctrine considered spiritually impure. Butchers, tanners, leather workers, gravediggers, executioners. That's it. That was the only reason. Now here is the part that makes this one of the strangest cases in human history. Modern DNA testing confirms that Burakumin people are genetically identical to mainstream Japanese people. There is no measurable genetic difference. They are not a separate group, not a different ethnic origin, not a different migration wave, not foreign blood brought from outside. They are, at the molecular level, completely and entirely Japanese. The discrimination was not based on blood. It was based on the memory of a job title held by a great-great-great-grandparent. Japan institutionalized this through a family registry system called the Koseki, detailed records tracking every family's lineage and ancestral occupation, maintained by the government, accessible to those who knew how to use it. And people used it. As recently as the 1990s, private detective agencies in Japan offered what were called Buraku investigation services. Companies would pay to investigate a potential employee's ancestry. Families would pay to investigate a potential spouse before allowing a marriage. They were checking whether someone's ancestor had the wrong job hundreds of years ago. Yes, this practice was not officially restricted until the mid-2000s, in a country with bullet trains, with some of the most advanced technology on Earth. The genetic science makes this heartbreaking in a very specific way. Japan spent centuries persecuting a group of people who were, at the molecular level, themselves. The bloodline they feared was their own blood. The impurity they were trying to avoid was completely imaginary. The Burakumin case strips away every comfortable myth about ancestry and purity. It shows us that identity is not something written in DNA. It is a story that societies choose to tell. And sometimes, the stories societies choose to tell are cruel fictions. Which brings us to where the science stands right now. In 2024, in 2025, in 2026. Because the ancient DNA research is still running. The machines are still sequencing. And the latest findings have just delivered the biggest twist of the entire story. In 2024, a team of researchers published a study in Nature Communications analyzing the genomes of over 250,000 modern Japanese individuals, the largest study of Japanese ancestry ever done, and it confirmed the three-population structure, Jomon, Yayoi, Kofun, holds consistently across the entire country. Then, in late 2025, a new preprint from Japanese research institutions went further. They sequenced 8 high-coverage Jomon genomes spanning 9,000 to 2,800 years ago. What they found revised the estimates upward. Jomon ancestry in mainland Japanese is likely closer to 20%, higher than previous estimates of 13%. Every few years, a new study moves the number. A new ancient tooth gives up its secrets. A new algorithm reads a genome that was previously unreadable, and each time, the picture gets more complex. Think about what we now know. There are 4 people who all carry a Japanese passport: a businessman in Tokyo, roughly 13 to 20% Jomon; an Okinawan grandmother, roughly 36% Jomon; an Ainu elder in Hokkaido, roughly 60 to 70% Jomon; a Burakumin family in Osaka, genetically indistinguishable from the Tokyo businessman. 4 different genetic proportions. One word: Japanese. Japan is not one thing. It was never one thing. It is a palimpsest, a document that has been written, partially erased, and written over again across 38,000 years of human movement, migration, collision, and survival. Every layer is still there, if you know how to read it. Yeah, and now, the part that will stay with you after this video ends. For all the DNA we have decoded, the Jomon, the Yayoi, the Kofun migrants, the Ainu, the Ryukyuans, there is still a signal in certain ancient Japanese genomes that does not fit any of these models. A faint, deep, ancient signal. Something older than the Jomon. Something that was on these islands before the people we have been calling the first inhabitants. Scientists have started calling them the pre-Jomon. We do not have their complete genome yet. We do not know their name. We do not know where they came from. We do not know what happened to them, but their ghost is there, in the data, in the bones, in the numbers that don't quite add up when you run the models. 38,000 years of survival, migration, love, war, ritual, and memory, encoded in 4 chemical letters, repeating 3 billion times in every cell of every person on those islands. Japan didn't become unique. It was assembled, slowly, violently, beautifully, from the most extraordinary genetic ingredients in the entire human story. And somewhere in a laboratory right now, a machine is spinning, reading ancient DNA pulled from a tooth buried in Japanese soil for 12,000 years. We don't yet know what it will say. But whatever it says, it will change the story again. Because with Japan's DNA, the story never truly ends. It just goes deeper.